approach the City Alliance for some recommendations, not the City Alliance Secretariat, but also its members. Would we have the right tools, the right references, the right toolkits, the right examples in place to address the question? Now, equitable economic growth then was for us, I think, identified as the way in which cities and local authorities and its management and governance bodies can steer the production and the maintenance of public services in the city, and how these public services and goods have an impact on economic growth trajectories. When we identified that more or less endeavor, it triggered two processes. One was a global, I think, attempt to better address and clarify this particular link between public services and goods and economic growth. And this triggered the inception of a joint work program chaired by and financed by DFID. Secondly, it triggered, I think, an endeavor to how to mainstream that orientation on equitable economic growth in our existing land services and citizenship programs financed by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And this actually led to this toolkit where we were asked to identify and procure an entity that could develop a further thinking, a conceptual thinking, but also something very practical that can be applied at the local level. This led to the production of the current toolkit. The cross-linkages between the joint work program and this toolkit is that the toolkit has been field tested in some of our participating cities of the joint work program, but it is also something that we can use in the future in some of those cities in to engage. But we are also aware that there are many toolkits out there. This is just one that would be applicable, and we will hear from Martin later on what's the difference between those and others. So today's webinar, if we manage to, yes, and I think Martin is online, will present the toolkit and the results from the rollout. Today I'm also very happy that we have Martin Clark on board from Triple Line. Martin is a senior development and service specialist. He has worked for the past 10 years in the field, so on urban planning issues, working with local governments, communities, and private sector organizations, both in the UK and Sub-Saharan Africa. I think, if I'm correct, he specialized more or less in the designing and implementing these kind of qualitative and quantitative instruments, survey instruments to inform strategic urban planning exercise. And I think he was working also, in particular in northern Nigeria and Kenya. In particular in Nigeria, I think it was for the Nigeria Infrastructure Advisory Facility that some of us know, and had been, I think, rolled out and extensively, I think, addressed the issue of data scarcity and urban development. So before I try now to give Martin the floor, I wanted to just share some of the procedures for today. We're going to ask Martin to introduce us to the toolkit. He has a presentation. You will see, I think, the slides hopefully in a couple of seconds. We are going to mute you during that presentation to reduce the background noise, but we will have an extensive Q&A session after the presentation, which will be moderated. So I would like, if you want then to address a question later on, there are two functions that you can use. It's one that the chat window. You can ask your question in the chat window. Or I think there is also a function that is called raise hand, if I'm not mistaken. And I would then invite you to address the question verbally. So, and if technology is with us, I think you can then also raise that verbally. If there are some technical hiccups with the connections, I just read your question and then invite Martin to answer. And Martin, perhaps You could explain a little bit about yourself, a little bit about, I think, the assignment, and in the meantime, I'm going to check with a colleague whether she can hear you.
Okay. I'll just introduce myself briefly and tell you a bit about the assignment. So, I'm Martin Clark. I'm a managing consultant in the urban development team at a company called IPE Triple Line, and we specialise in international development consultancy. And I was very fortunate to be engaged through Cities Alliance on this Equitable Economic Growth in Cities project over about the last 12 months or so. So, equitable economic growth in cities, what do we know about it? So the starting point for this assignment really was to build on the definition of what equitable economic growth means for cities that Cities Alliance has been developing. And this was really that you can't have equitable economic growth without having kind of economic opportunities in the form of decent, productive employment that can be accessed by everybody, all of society, regardless of economic status, gender, ethnicity, etc. Now, more often than not, increasingly anyway, in cities of the global south, we're not seeing this form of equitable growth, and we're not seeing the benefits of urbanization harnessed properly to deliver the kind of economies of scale and agglomeration economies that you would typically expect as a country moves from a sort of less to more urbanized society. So the challenge that was really set to Triple Line was to kind of develop a toolkit which would allow, say, the mayor of a small or medium-sized town in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere in the global south to really kind of start to understand what equitable economic growth means for the city, what kind of opportunities and constraints there are, particularly those that the municipal government or the municipality has some influence over, that would allow our mayor to move from a situation of doing nothing to doing something towards fostering more equitable economic growth. So, Fred, slide number 3, please, which should be, I think, a list of bullets as to what happens when urbanization goes wrong, essentially, and the entry points for corrective action that our mayor can take. So, if left to itself, urbanization is not guaranteed to be equitable. Certainly, if it's in any way captured, or if it's left to monopolistic or vested interests, then instead of urbanization being a boom for economic growth, it's likely to become a brake on economic growth. And again, more often than not, in cities, in emerging economies, what we're seeing are significant constraints to economic growth in the form of poor access to public goods and services, basic services and essential infrastructure, essentially, which are a likely necessary condition of achieving more equitable outcomes in economic terms. And this really affects the city in 2 ways. It affects the development of human capital, where unequal access to kind of public goods will limit the opportunities available to individuals to better themselves, to develop skills and education or improved health and well-being, which in turn would allow them to become gainfully employed. And on the other side of the coin is the kind of private sector enabling environment where poor access or unequal access to public goods for firms is likely to limit their prospects in terms of increasing productivity, competitiveness, etc. If we think about access to public goods then as an entry point for municipal governments who want to and can play a more proactive role in creating a better enabling environment for generating more productive and decent employment. And this can create a virtuous cycle, essentially, where if if the conditions are right, and urban local governments, in partnership with other stakeholders, are able to provide more equitable access to basic services and essential infrastructure, then the impacts that access will have on both citizens and businesses complement one another, both in terms of the ability for individuals to provide additional skills, if you like, to a labour market, and for businesses to become more productively competitive in order to employ more people. And the virtuous cycle there is really if the local or urban local government is then able to capture the added value there through, for example, local taxes, then they can invest again more in the provision of basic services and essential infrastructure. Okay, Fred, on we go. So this should now be the next section, which is I'll describe now that was the kind of starting point. Now I'll describe how we developed a toolkit from that conceptual understanding, and really what the toolkit does. So, Fred, there should be a slide called Diagnostic Toolkit with some bullet points on it.
Yep, perfect.
Great. So, I mean, the brief, if you like, was to develop a simple but not simplistic diagnostic toolkit. We knew that we were working in smaller towns and cities in sub-Saharan Africa initially, and that these were perhaps some of the most under-resourced in terms of capacity, capability, and certainly in terms of data and information relating to the economy and to access to public goods. So the toolkit had to reflect that. It also, we needed to reflect a need to develop insight rapidly and in an incremental way. So even with a low starting point, put in place a structured tool which would enable cities to develop more depth to their insight over time. The toolkit was supposed to complement any existing reporting frameworks and planning tools, so complementary as opposed to in competition with, and ideally to strengthen our understanding of the relationship between provision of access to public goods and equitable growth. And finally, just to begin to identify key entry points for local governments to prioritise actions, corrective actions, to foster more equitable forms of growth. Okay, so Fred, the next slide, which should be something called Toolkit as a Process, I hope.
Yep.
With three boxes on. So the toolkit is quite simple, and it's kind of broken into three parts. It's a process, it's not just a product. And the idea here was that initially we conducted some kind of situational assessment of the situation with regards to access to public goods and services as that impacts on firms and individuals. And I'll describe that process in a little more detail very shortly. And related to that is then a kind of deeper dive, a more causal analysis, if you like, of the reasons why access is inequitable, and starting to think about ways in which we might overcome those barriers. And then finally, looking at a solutions framework, or putting forward some convincing policy solutions to the problems that we'd identified. And our job, if you like, was to test the toolkit and take a handful of municipalities through that process. Okay, Fred, next slide, which should be titled Situation Assessment.
Yes.
Awesome, this is working. Okay, so again, just reflecting on the two sides of the toolkit, really. So we're looking at citizens and individuals on one hand, and we're looking at local businesses or private sector on the other hand, and the different or impacts that access to public goods or non-inclusive access can have on both of those groups. So the toolkit is essentially broken down to identify the different access characteristics for those two groups. Okay, Fred, should be now a slide called Data Capture.
Yes.
Okay, so in a slightly abstract way, then these are the kind of types or groups of data that we're collecting on. We're collecting some kind of basic contextual information on the city itself, so kind of stuff you'd usually find: demographics, stuff around the economy and employment, sectoral breakdown, who's employed where, level of unemployment, and also something around the strength or health of municipal finances, which comes back to the kind of influence that the municipal government can have on influencing equitable growth. So that's the top three boxes. And they're really focused on firm level interactions. And the second half then is a deeper dive into looking at specific public goods and services as they're accessed by individuals. And there are 6 broad categories here: wash, energy or power, health services and facilities, education, connectivity, more abstract concepts, I suppose, about general access and mobility in and around the city, and then land and housing. Okay, Fred, skip to the next slide, which should say one-page workbooks.
Oh. Not types of indicator.
Okay, types of indicator, fine. Okay, so essentially we're looking at the bottom half of those of the toolkit now, which is access to public goods specifically. And we felt that it wasn't enough to merely describe overall levels of access, but we should attempt to explain levels of access. So for each indicator, what we took we broke down, we described an overall level of access, if you like, for citizens as a whole in the city. And then we attempted to disaggregate or deconstruct that level of access according to kind of pricing, distribution, production of those public goods. Or we recast those as coverage or physical coverage of each public good, the affordability or cost of each, and then how reliable access to those public goods were. And we created a framework which was flexible enough to allow cities to delve into that to a level of depth that they were either capable of or comfortable with. Okay, Fred, next slide. Should be the triangle.
Mm-hmm.
So really, just to reiterate that we felt it wasn't enough to just explain overall levels of access, but we wanted to try and deconstruct what access meant across 3 dimensions: affordability, coverage, and reliability. Okay, Fred, next one.
Now you have the one-page workbooks.
Okay, workbooks. So to make life easier, or to kind of present the toolkit in a friendly way, we designed a series of one-page workbooks which address each public good in turn, and also presented a local business questionnaire for businesses to answer, a municipal finances questionnaire, and some more contextual background information, each contained in a simple one-page workbook which held a similar and hopefully familiar format. Each workbook captures information both in terms of levels of access to public goods and some more contextual, qualitative judgments, if you like. And it does so by describing a core and a supporting indicator. Now, the point about flexibility here is that for some of our smaller towns and cities, and this was certainly true of the ones we visited, it was only really possible for cities to have a general professional opinion about overall access and also coverage, affordability and reliability of certain public goods. So the core indicator is really a slightly qualitative attempt for a city to at least make an attempt at describing access. Now, if they are slightly more well-resourced and have access to more recent data, household surveys, for example, then the workbooks at the toolkit allow them to progress to a more kind of detailed, quantitative description of that access. And for the really well-resourced cities, we then built in some flexibility for them to be able to disaggregate further, say by household characteristics or geographic location. Okay, Fred.
Summary scorecard.
Excellent. So what you've got when you put all of these scores together is a somewhat stylized traffic light system, which is designed to provide a sort of snapshot and at a glance view of overall access to these 8 public goods, so from top to bottom: water, sanitation, solid waste management, power, health, education, connectivity, land and housing. And then from left to right, describing first of all the overall access and then the kind of disaggregated scores in an attempt to explain overall output. It's labeled on this. So in this example, for example, you can start to see that although affordability of the top 4, if you like, public goods and under supporting indicators was reasonably positive, there were some concerns over the physical coverage of those top 3 public goods. So overall, we can see that access levels suffer, perhaps because physical coverage of each service is not really as good as it could be, although in theory those goods should be affordable to many. Okay, Fred, next slide.
Convergent analysis we have.
Great. Okay, so this is really bringing it all together. So despite the fact we had a simple framework for collecting information, obviously you generate quite a lot of data, and this diagram attempts to kind of set out how you move from the situational assessment through to causal analysis and then solutions framework. And it is very much a case of a type of convergent analysis where you use your quantitative database scores and more qualitative, maybe subjective scores to come to some kind of consensus over the likely impact that unequal access to these goods and services, the impact that that's having on both the productive potential of firms and businesses, and also the employability, if you like, of individuals. And from that point of view, this was very much a participatory process where the scorecard on the previous slide really came into its own. What we found is that the initial scoring, it's not necessarily the initial absolute scoring that is as important as the conversation that is generated out of stakeholders coming together, sitting around the scorecard and discussing why they felt access was unequal to some public goods as opposed to others, and the reasons behind that. And that's really where the kind of causal analysis falls out of that ongoing discussion, and then a more reasoned solutions framework can be offered as to why or what policy direction the municipal government go in to try and correct some of those inequalities. Okay, Fred. On to the in summary slide. And there should be a list of bullet points.
Key strengths.
Excellent. Okay. So really just a reminder, ideally this was a simple but not simplistic toolkit which doesn't require big data or lots of data, but really lean and critical data points. As I said, our starting point was working in environments, in urban localities where data was scarce, and that the toolkit provides an entry point for structuring data collection around a common goal, delivering equitable economic growth, and that despite the fact different cities might be at different points in terms of the amount of information they collect or the capability of people to analyze it, you have a common framework, common structure for collecting information, which can, at least in some sense, allow you to benchmark or compare between cities and even between countries. Likewise, depending on the amount of information you collect and the depth of that information, would also be reflected in the depth of the insight that you're able to provide, but recognizing that this is an incremental process. The other point about the toolkit is that it's not designed to confuse or tie up urban local governments and yet more filling in of questionnaires and collecting information from people. The overall indicators that we included in the toolkit reflect either international best practice standards in delivering infrastructure and public services, or the kind of planning tools and frameworks that you would increasingly see urban local governments being expected to report on, for example, sustainable development goals. So we've incorporated those into the toolkit and also provided some flexibility. For example, if cities or nation states have their own targets or goals that they're working towards. And the final point really is, again, it's on engagement. In many ways, this was a somewhat surprising outcome of pilot testing the toolkit. We worked through the design of the toolkit with 4 different cities in 4 different countries and received various levels of feedback on the questions, the process throughout the pilot testing process. And this enabled us to kind of constantly improve on the toolkit. But one of the strongest things that came out was that the outputs from the toolkit allow people to, as I said before, build a discussion around the nature of access to public goods and the impact that would have on equitable growth, and from that conversation help you identify priority entry points for local governments. Not forgetting, of course, that there are a number of other influential factors that can either retard or promote equitable growth in cities. And for an urban local government with limited resources and time, it's really a case of trying to prioritize where they can get most bang for their buck. Okay, Fred.
On to Dory.
Okay, and then I'll just show you a couple of examples of the kind of outputs that we produced from the process of using the toolkit and some of the associated analysis. We were actually commissioned to prepare some city equitable growth appraisals of each city, and this was really the kind of high-level product of that work, which was a 1-page snapshot which sets out the drivers of equitable growth for each town and the constraints, and also the contextual data information with regards to access to public goods. And again, another point to engage on, but also to maybe promote the city in different ways. So you should have one there for Dory and also one for Barley.
Yep.
So what was interesting about producing these was, again, they're quite visual. City stakeholders found that they were useful in terms of providing just a very simple summary of the work we're doing and a useful snapshot to then compare against over time. And then the final slide, I think, was this was something we presented to Cities Alliance back in June or July, where we were trying to demonstrate that across the 4 cities we visited, it's quite easy with a structured framework of data to then compare the performance of different cities across either, in this case, access to the 7 or 8 public goods a kind of development partner programmatic perspective, but also useful for cities themselves to engender some kind of healthy competition between cities and reflect on how they felt their city's doing in relation to others. And I think that's us.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin, for the presentation, given also the technical hiccups and environment that we are currently having. Just also highlight that the toolkit, as Martin said, is a particular, it's a diagnostic toolkit, but we were very, very attentive to the engagement process. So it's a toolkit for engagement. So it's a toolkit consisting more or less of an Excel sheet that can ask questions on better understand the service provision within the city, but also then allows some diagnostics, but also the data availability. This is the second point. We started the assignment on the premise that we don't expect much from the cities that they don't have the data, and particularly in data scarce environments, the environment that we work with in secondary cities. The toolkit allowed also to, I think, also answer within yes and no questions, binary questions. So what do you think, or to make an educated guess. So this kind of engagement I found very, very interesting because just to raise the attention to some of the data gaps within the city. So thank you very much, Martin. We are now coming to, I think, the question and answer session. So if I can ask those that are still on, and I see the great list, and I'm very happy that you stayed on board for that. If you have any questions, you have two possibilities. One, the chat function. You can include your question in the chat, and then I would invite you to verbalize this. And or you can raise the hand. But I think if you would like to address a question to Martin or comment on it, and please feel free to now type in your question in the chat function.
You can also just write something in the chat function, and we can then unmute you, and you can pose your question.
So is there anyone who would like to share some thoughts at this point? I don't see any at this point, but perhaps, Martin, let me ask you a question. So one of the key, I think, questions that we have also addressed in the joint, or currently addressing in the joint work program is, okay, access to basic services and infrastructure is one thing, and this has been a classical, I think, type of endeavor and development, also for the City Alliance, access to basic services. First question is, what makes it different if we think about the economic growth function? So what kind of services in particular do you find in that engagement is something that has a clear relationship to growth trajectories? That's one question. And the second is about the informality. So now we believe we know that the informal sector plays an incredible role in providing services, right? And also, I mean, filling gaps that the municipality has left out of because of several reasons, because of the speed of urbanization, because of the lack of governance in certain areas. So, how does the toolkit can help us to address, bridging that knowledge and engagement gap with the informal economy?
Okay, thanks, Renee. So let me just get that right. So the first question was around which public goods in particular have the relationship with growth trajectories?
Yeah, what would, from your engagement now in the cities with the toolkit, where do you see the direct link? I mean, we can say all of the public services, but is there anything in particular that you can see a clear relationship in?
Okay, and then the second one was about bridging the gap between the informal formal economy and how we can incorporate that into these kind of economic development planning processes, I suppose. Yes,
in particular, how this is, I mean, Informality means also, there are services, public services delivered by community groups, for example, that are perhaps unknown of. How does this toolkit could lead to an engagement to get this on, I think, on the radar?
Yeah, okay. All right, let me do that in order then. So, yeah, I mean, when we first approached this piece of work and we were trying to look at these entry points, if you like, that municipal governments can follow to address concerns over more equitable forms of growth, I suppose you're right. The obvious ones are that, provision of infrastructure is typically cited as a constraint to growth. Now, I think the most important part of the toolkit, from our perspective, that didn't necessarily come out in the presentation was the angle of looking at those constraints from the perspective of smaller or local businesses or the local business community. I think that is probably something that and relates to the second part of the question on informality, is that nobody's really thinking about, or it was clear from us, at least in the 4 cities we visited, that nobody was really thinking about the impact on the local business community of unequal access to public goods. I think there's an assumption that the economy is ticking along somehow, and there's obviously, visibly lots of economic activity in some of these towns, but certainly from a kind of a local economic development planning perspective, nobody's really giving much thought to the kind of impact that unequal access on certain public goods have on, say, small businesses. Obviously, people have access, or firms have access to power in some form, or water in some form. But what you tend to find is that the smaller, kind of less formal businesses have sort of much larger proportional outlays on some of these services, or the opportunity costs of obtaining them are much higher. And I think through encouraging a more open dialogue on this whole aspect of accessing public goods through a kind of structured and regular business engagement, or a business questionnaire, basically, you start to tease out some of those and put some numbers behind it. The other thing you mentioned, Renee, about having a difference between the tick box exercise and data is that it's quite interesting to compare in some ways, and we deliberately did this with the toolkit. The answers, say, the local economic development officer would give to some questions versus the actual a more evidence-based approach, to see that and to demonstrate that there was a gap in thinking, perhaps, between what those responsible for managing the city thought and what the situation on the ground perhaps actually was. So I think that's one thing. In terms of the informal sector, I think I probably undersold the toolkit again here, in that it clearly isn't just the two groups. It's the two groups, individuals and firms, but it's also kind of 3 parties, if you like. You've got the city managers, municipal government, private sector, and obviously the community at large, and that includes community groups and others who may, as you point out, actually end up performing the role of service provider. The point of having a toolkit that allows you to take a deeper dive and disaggregate data is to say that there are differences, again, between say the cost to a household of obtaining water through the registered utility versus the cost of obtaining water through an informal service provider, or say a solid waste service that's delivered by informal sector providers. And the toolkit allows a municipality to actually kind of look at those differences, if you like, rather than just assuming that everybody is comfortable receiving the service in the way they do. This is really a way of looking at the differences in proportional terms of say, the costs of access, and maybe also demonstrating demonstrating that the scale of informal service provision, one of the clear things that came out from using the toolkit was that only in one case, I think, out of the 4 cities, did the municipality really have a handle on the level of economic activity and the size of, say, informal settlements in these cities. It was really a black hole, and a lot of that comes from not having enough data, or perhaps not having a policy which allowed them to really engage with attempting to address informality. So the one example of the town we went to, which that wasn't the case, was in Bali, and in Bali, and I think perhaps you and Fred are familiar with that town in particular. Maybe some of you are a town in the northeast of Uganda, where there's a very active civil society, and in particular very active Slum Dwellers Federation, who work hand in hand with the municipal government, doing just that, generating information on levels of informal economic activity, numbers of people living in informal settlements, and the means and characteristics of delivering public goods and services to those people in those areas. And it was a very important relationship that was missing from some of those other cities.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. Do we have some other questions? I fear we are running out of time because of the technical hiccup at the start. I also need to mention that because of the different technologies that we are now using, Skype and WebEx, we were not able to record it. So, Martin, unfortunately, you will need to do this again at some point. But I'm looking forward to that. But nevertheless, are there any questions at this point? And if you do have a question, please let us know through the chat. But I see there are none. So with that, I think I would suggest to close on time. And I would like to thank you, Martin, for bearing with us and trying the best. And we figured out a surprising way to connect you. I got just the question whether the toolkit will be available. Of course, we are going to also share the presentation today. We haven't yet published the whole, because this should be indeed an engagement through the webinar session, and something in particular that we're going to post on it, and we would like to market that toolkit accordingly, because we do believe this is very well done. I would also like to thank all the attendees and for the patience. And with that, I would suggest to close the call. And thank you all for joining. And we will be back with you and with a presentation and also an update on what's coming next. So thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for joining this webinar.
Thank you, everybody. And hopefully that all came across loud and clear.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.